This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Ifetayo Flannery, who teaches in the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. Her research focuses on Black studies methodology, questions of identity across the African diaspora, and the expansive significance of religious traditions. Along with a number of scholarly articles, she is the author of Lineage, Religious Culture and the Remakings of Ethnic Identity in the African Diaspora, and the editor of the collection, An Introduction to Black Psychology. In this conversation, we discuss the origins of Black studies as a discipline, the contributions and challenges of Africological approaches to the field, and how Black studies methodologies shape and reshape ethical, political, and cultural life. Good afternoon, Ifetayo. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on the Black Studies Podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation. You're at Temple University, and of course, that program is so historic. And so for that reason alone, very important to get Temple folks on the podcast, both people with PhDs from there, but also teaching there. So, and also I think your research interests are just really central to the field and to the, past and future of Black studies. So hearing you talk about all of these things is going to be a really important contribution to the series. So welcome to the Black Studies Podcast, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it myself.
We'll have a chance to talk, of course, about how you think about Black studies and how you think about your research in relation to it, the history and future of the field. But I wanted to start off with really a more personal question and ask you, what drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And what keeps you connected to this kind of work?
Yes, I always start with I was an undergraduate at Georgia State University in Atlanta when I even first heard that there was a such thing as Black studies, African American studies. And I ended up in this intro course because an academic advisor said, "You're missing a credit for something. Why don't you do this?" And I said, wow, I was like a sophomore. And in that intro to African American Studies course, I have felt like I had learned more than I did in my entire K through 12. It was a paradigm shift. And that was the opening to the pathway that I ended up taking. I didn't know it would take me this far. And so because of the phenomenal work of the faculty there, my earliest things I was intrigued about were cultural questions about power shifts over time and power dynamics, and definitely for me personally, historical rationale. So why did this happen? Or why was Nat Turner's rebellion, happening at this particular time? Or why did people boycott? Or, why did people decide to change their names in the 70s and 80s for cultural nationalist reasons? So rationale for historical motive and power shifts and culture drew me in. I mean, I'm from the South. I'm from New Orleans originally, but people know me as someone from Atlanta because that was my coming of age. So I didn't enter Black studies not being familiar with Black people. I grew up in very Black places and the culture as it was, but to study it sort of from an aerial view and to understand the whys and the philosophical underpinnings of time was something that I could not resist.
I love that. First of all, I just have to say, not to make the podcast temporarily about me, but hearing you say Georgia State, my kid's going to do his master's in teaching at Georgia State starting in the fall. So.
Oh, congratulations.
He's also
I had a great experience there.
he's about to graduate from college in a week and then go straight to be an educator, which I love. So anyways, it's nice to hear Georgia State. But I'm interested, you talked about how how that the recommendation. I love these chance stories, right? That just some advisor was like, "Hey, you should make up this credit," and then it puts you on this different trajectory. I'm interested in also hearing you talk maybe a little bit about the longer sort of horizon of that. Was it really a shift from your K through 12 and up through into your sophomore year of college, like a complete paradigm shift that way? Or was it sort of pulling back to something that had intrigued you or been a part of your education previously?
I have to be honest to my story, and I would say it was a complete shift. There were things that we were pushed to consider, debating reparations, debating, you know, um, at what point did we go from African to Negro to Black to colored to African American, and why? Like, I never considered those things, and they were never asked in my K through 12 education. I went to regular public schools in a variety of cities and states around this country. We moved a lot, and they weren't the worst of schools either. But there were questions that were asked in an African American studies context that I felt like I had never even broached, in my former education. So it was definitely a paradigm shift. That got deeper over time because different programs, African American studies programs, have different foci. So even entering into this other paradigm shift to ask the questions of the self and the questions of the nature of history and time and motivation of my ancestors, I even went through probably like 3 to 4 evolutionary stages even within that new paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is always an interesting part of teaching Black studies for me, is how many students have that sense of you haven't put it this way really, but it also sounds like it was this kind of moment, version of this kind of moment for you. But students will often talk about how they hadn't realized how little they had been asked about and how little they had learned about the thing that as Black students, they felt deeply comfortable with their own identity, their community, their family, etc. But there was like this moment of being like, that has been completely absent my education. What does it mean that this is an entire field of study? And I think that's the magic of classrooms, right? As it has this possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, even spatially. So, obviously I work in the collegiate sector now, so I don't want to say I understand the full pulse of the K through 12 at the moment, but in some of my engagement with younger people, even asking them they probably can't name that many African countries or any, even contemporary sort of president of any African country, or,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's an international, way of approaching Black studies too that expands the parameter of what is considered world history that is not taught in K through 12, and even locally. It's somewhat common for Black studies, and I think it could be capitalized on. I know at LMU in LA and at the Rutgers campuses in Camden, their Black studies departments, they always offer like a history of LA or a history of Black Camden. And we should definitely have a history of Black Philadelphia at Temple. But even those localized histories, we did some of that at Georgia State. There's so much there that people can hold on to and attach to that is remiss in a general landscape of like public education.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I think a lot about my own department. We regularly have a couple of different classes that do a sort of history of Black Baltimore, but we're not in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the D.C. area, and sort of Prince George's County has such an important place in the history of African American life. as well as DC, of course, and sort of what does it mean when those courses aren't there? I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it's also like we're missing this really important. I like that Camden and LMU have these kinds of courses. It's a good model. I'm going to bring this up in my next department meeting.
Oh, yes.
I'm not an historian, so they're going to be mad. They're going to be like, "Why are you assigning us a new class?" But still. But that maybe this is a nice segue then into a question I have for you, and this I think this is just an interesting question always, but especially for people who have done doctorates in Black Studies, and that is, what is that portrait you work with of Black Studies? And I always ask this in the context of its origin story, which was both an intellectual demand and a political demand by students, that students had demanded that there be a place to study Black life, Black intellectual traditions, that English departments, history departments, sociology departments had not even begun to do this adequately. And Black Studies was demanded as a place for the Black intellectual tradition to be studied, developed, and cultivated. But of course, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that's that moment where the radicalization of Black liberation struggle had really contested those boundaries between a classroom and a community, between a campus and political mobilization, between the study of ideas and political prescriptions. And so I think we inherit this tension, or this sort of two aspects of the founding of the field of Black Studies in terms of the political demands of Black Studies, but also the commitment to intellectual traditions. And I think that's a tension really at the heart of the field. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about what's that portrait of Black Studies you work with, sort of in the context of its founding tension.
So I teach this course called Pro Seminar. It's a graduate course in African American Studies, which is entirely dedicated to the history of the field, the major debates, the founding thinkers, and even what's to come. We always do a survey at the end of the course in terms of looking at various terminal degree departments, what they're offering, to determine what's the direction of the future of the field based off people's concentrations and interest. And I think you're right in ways where people have identified that there must be some tension and between staying true to the community or community work and then the life of intellectual production.
Mhm.
But I don't think that tension should exist in the way that we continue to accent it, because different people have been doing different things before the institutionalization of Black studies. And I think that's very important to remember the scope of Black studies and what it's meant to do. In my opinion, if we think about W.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson, and then Nathan Hare, of course, the first chair, we think about, and John Henry Clark, this sort of strong politicized sort of orientation to the narration, the historicization of Black people, and a push for solving our own problems. That's one of the pillars I think that Black studies should do in the contemporary era, in the future too. One of the things it should be doing is solving Black people's own problems. That's some of the founding thing. But there were other people, there were cultural theorists in the past and in the present, like Zora Neale Hurston and Marin Botany and Francisco S. Wilson, and even Darlene Clark Houghton in a more contemporary time. And these cultural theorists were people who were also dedicated to scripting the actual history and traditions, the cultural
Mhm.
traditions of the people. And I think that's the other part of Black studies, is that we have to present our culture and our traditions to the world as we define and see them. And some of that is not always the problem solving of policies and the politics of national boundaries or white supremacy. And I think people get it mixed up, or this is just my perspective. The development of Black studies was not simply to fight white supremacy.
Mhm.
Now, that may be, people may be like, what? But hear me out. The development of Black studies happened within the context of political demand against the disenfranchisement of Black people. And so, of course, you're going to get developments of like critical race theory and all this that can be housed within Black studies. But in the long trajectory that started before 1969, in the classification of history, culture, people, and the scope of whatever it can be in the future, it cannot be defined only by political protest. That's a subfield. It has to engage the entire breadth of African civilization into the future. And it has done that. But in the way people define Black studies, when it comes time to define it, it becomes narrowly focused on just political antagonism. But the actual practice of Black studies has to be dedicated to something beyond any particular political protest of the moment. Otherwise, let's say, that all our problems were resolved and there was no intentional strife with other groups in the country. Is there a necessity for Black studies if there was no white supremacy?
Mm-hmm.
If everybody is equal and full integration occurs, does Black studies have a purpose? And so I pose that Black studies is to solve our problems, which we will encounter political power dynamics, but it is also there no matter the time, place, and history, from the beginning of time until the end of the future, to be the place where we can draw from a true narrative of our culture and traditions, where we can see ourselves and present ourselves to the world. And this is a place where mythology lives. This is a place where theory lives. This is a place where oral traditions live. This is a place where the uncanny nature of these beautiful stories of biographies and autobiographies live.
Mm-hmm.
The totality of Black life is not just fighting. And sometimes that's overstated. And then we miss the, quote, humanization aspect of Black people, which people are so invested in proving. So that's sort of my perspective on the purpose of the field and the trajectory and the scope of what is included.
I love that. It's interesting listening to talk as well that, early on in this podcast, I think your episode will be like 261, 262, something like that. And very early in the podcast series, I used to ask, and sometimes my collaborator Ashley would ask, about is the purpose of Black studies to become, a permanent fixture, right? A permanent sort of kind of inquiry, or to eventually not be necessary, right? And I've stopped asking that question for various reasons. I think it kind of gets addressed in multiple other questions. But, the way you put it there is such an important way of not just thinking about the future of Black studies, but just the very nature of what it is that's being done, as you say, like to present the world, to present to the world. And, that was really, I think about Du Bois at the turn of the century. This was absolutely how he understood the project, right, of the Negro Academy,
Mm-hmm.
and the turn of the century and these sorts of things, or Aimé Césaire and thinking about post-colonial sort of identity formation. So I love that you put that really well, and it connects to such important texts. We could list, so many others, but thank you for that.
Yes. I do want to say this too. Sometimes Black studies is seen as an exploration of how Black people have existed in the world, per se, like what has happened to them. We have went through slavery, we have been through this, we have been through that. Racism exists, and this is how we engage with or interact with it. But if we are really invested in the long trajectory of Black studies, I do think it's important to realize that Black studies is not just an assessment of what has happened to Black people. Black studies should be a place where we utilize methodology to describe how Black people interpret reality in general, and how we see the world from our unique cultural and historic vantage point. And so then the topics and the nature of it is truly endless.
So that's actually a nice segue into this next question I had for you, to ask about your research in relation to the history and future of Black studies. You work with an interesting mix of religious studies, psychology, and Black studies methodologies. And I'm interested in how the kinds of insights you see, this collaboration of critical frames, uh, how you see the insights into Black life that come from that relate to the history of the field. Like, where does it fit in the history of Black studies? But also, what new horizons do you think your research is trying to open up, and what boundaries do you think it pushes?
Hmm. Say the last part again.
I'm interested in the sort of new horizons that you think for Black studies, that you think your research opens up, and what boundaries you think it pushes, but as well as
Same.
where it fits in the history of the field.
Yes, I love that question. Um, Certainly, a lot of the Black psychologists, that work overlaps deeply early on with the field in terms of identifying, levels of Black consciousness and identity constructs and all of these workings and IQ testing and educational expansion. And so this was sort of some of the earliest scientific studies um, that I was attracted to describe the nature of Black realities and experiences. And so getting into religion is somewhat more recent. Well, it depends on what you say is recent. I've been thinking about it and working on this for like 10 years. And what I found that especially as I went deeper, like I was saying before, a little bit beyond just what is happening to Black people, when I really wanted to go deeper into the ancestral memory, the motivations, the narrative location that can be identifiable not just in one Black individual or in one location, one country, but what is the thing that actually connects people of African descent that is sort of a hallmark of wherever you find us, you find this.
Mhm.
Okay. And so when I started to go deeper into those questions, getting deeper into religion, ancestral traditions, again, the cultural questions, the motivations, things that have been inherited over time.
Mhm.
Um, I found this to be so important. And a lot of the Black psychologists have dibbled and dabbled without necessarily calling it religion in their construction of the worldview concepts. That there is a such thing as an African worldview and the philosophical underpinnings of what is the African ontology, cosmology, axiology, that we can see over time, no matter where you find people. What are the things that they do the same?
Mhm.
Um, and what are things that people do different at the surface level of culture. I do believe that culture and tradition are two different things. This is coming out in some of my newer intellectual work in my new book, and really defining some of these massive concepts to provide generalization but also nuance. But where do we do that? Where do we largen the scope and where do we shrink the scope? I do believe there's a difference between tradition and culture. Culture is something that it should change because every generation has something innovative to contribute. Languages change, and technology changes, and that becomes a part of people's way of life. But traditions, whatever it is that is our tradition, this has a more longevity. This is the sort of
Mhm.
underpinning of cultural histories and groups. And in that area of tradition, I found that religious traditions, spoke to deeper things of cosmology. Like there's a certain way that Black people think about the afterlife, and that they think about the certain way they sing about going home, where home is always somewhere other than Earth.
Mm.
Earth is not our home. We want to go home to be with our Lord. How did we come to these constructs? How do we really see the nature of the world, the invisible connected to the material? Over these long breaths of times, you can start to see that there's connections in mythology and practice and belief, even where language in culture, which is a superficial layer of why we do what we do, can be seen different and non-connected. And so all of those things together, the psychology, the religious um, traditions of the people is what comes together for me, both in the contemporary Black studies, in the future of Black studies, and also in the past of Black studies, to piece together these, again, narrative locations, defining cultural aspects that make Black studies unique from sociology, from history, from English. If all we're doing is talking about race, which is a modern construct, if the only way we know how to define us is by saying we're Black, then you're only able to make that a reasonable conclusions up until a certain point in history, because there was no Black 400 years ago. That's not the reason why people would organize together. So how do we rationalize why we did what we did to get to this place? So some of these things must become a bit more stretched. I think that's where I stretch the boundary, because my new work is going to confront the academy's sort of stoic location and only using race, gender, and class to define all human phenomena. It doesn't matter what you study, or we're all trained to some kind of way fit anything and everything we've done into somewhat of a race, gender, or class construct to make sense of all human phenomena. And I think that, that is, we're selling ourselves short. And what Black studies can be doing to offer to the world, what I'm trying to do with some of my newer works is to present these other epistemological categories that have always existed that we can use, in particular, identity constructs of ethnic identity as opposed to race, and construct of religion as an epistemological framework, which definitely impacts the way Black people kind of enter into rationale. So when you encounter someone and if you encounter Black people and they may say, I had a dream about this or this or this, so I'm not certain anymore. Or I have a feeling, about this or this or this. And a lot of times people have misread that as Black people are too emotional or they're irrational. But in fact, we use these sort of spiritual messages or these alternative ways of receiving information as to make rational decisions. But it's not read that way because we're not using a religious epistemology to understand that there is a rational reason why I would have a dream about something and then change my mind about an activity I'm doing in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And so these are different ways to approach, what has actually happened, and how we're making decisions collectively and why, and, which can lead us into further questions about whatever it is that we need to know to solve our own problems.
This is super interesting. No pressure, but you got to finish this book.
I finished it, yes.
Oh, I thought you said
yes.
you're working on. Okay.
Well, I finished it, and so it's in production now. So maybe at the top of
Fantastic.
2027, we will see it on the shelf.
Excellent. Because I think that's really interesting to think about the way you were talking about tradition and this is my own interest as well, just in how we conceive tradition. I think it's a word that's often used very casually, but when you start to think very rigorously about it, it's both an extremely complicated term, which I think you laid out really nicely there, but it's also potentially generative of so many insights and really like reframing so many of the ways we talk about, as you say, those critical frames that are so easy to fall back on in terms of organizing human experience. So all to say, I love that. I'm glad it's finished and on its way. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Yeah, tell the production people to hurry up. Sort of continuing with that, I'm interested to hear you talk a little bit more about your research and sort of in this frame, that your PhD work and your appointments have been in Black studies. You haven't come to Black studies research and teaching through a discipline. You haven't come through history or through English or through sociology. You haven't come through a sort of more traditional discipline. So I'm interested in how you think that background and then series of appointments in Black studies, how you think that has shaped how you conceive a research project, but also how it shapes how you conceive and practice a classroom.
Oh, that's an excellent question. I am a part of still, maybe there's only 2 generations now of people who might have gotten all of their degrees and their faculty appointments within the field itself. It's still
Mhm.
a new thing to see that. Um
There's a handful on the series, and I just sorry to interrupt you, but I
mhm.
think this is such an important perspective to have when your entire work has been in the field, like, how does it impact all of these questions? So
Absolutely. I think I might only be whatever could be considered second generation, maybe even first generation of people like that. So, one of the things, because I did have a double major in psychology in undergrad to have some comparison, in terms of academic field. And one of the things I will say that has privileged um, my ability to formulate newer concepts, theories. What I feel is growth that is able to happen at a somewhat of a fast rate is because of being located for a long enough period of time in Black studies
mhm,
to have those evolutionary thinking periods that I mentioned earlier. You
mhm,
know, so if you only exposed to Black studies maybe for 2 years, a master's, or for 4 years or something, and then you have 8 years of something else, that is your foundation. And so, those other, fields, they have their own concepts, theories, they have their own way they have constructed the world, and your training will influence how you contend with those things. People don't typically discard all of what they've known when they're entering Black studies sort of at a later date or only as a faculty, but never as a student. You're not going to discard everything you know. And so the things that, one is able to sort of mature in ideas is always going to have external influence, or at least be in debate or in conversation with,
mhm.
because that has informed your psychological and intellectual development. And so one of the things that I feel like has privileged me in a sense, and I hope this comes out in some of the works that I produce and am producing, is that it's allowed me time to maturate in ideas that have come solely from the long history and production of Black people who have studied certain ideas and concepts for years and decades and decades and decades and decades.
Mhm.
And then I have time to reflect over decades and decades and decades of historical content and debates within the field. And so then I'm in a position where I have to push things further, and so especially methodologically. And I do credit a lot of this to Temple University's sort of PhD program. We really didn't have a huge focus on history itself, but the that PhD program is heavily philosophical, heavily theoretical and methodological. So to say that it's not so much what you study, but how are you studying it?
Mhm.
How are you going to define periodization? If you are doing a historiography, why would you start with colonialism, for example? That's starting history from a European vantage point, from how they see the world and what they were doing in the world. What were African people doing in 700 AD? What were Caribbean people doing, in 1975? So these are things, how you're even beginning to ask a research question. What concepts would you use? What time periods would be most important when you're not using sort of a Eurocentric orientation to world history? Those things really also shifted my ability to try to force myself to retrain myself to think about Black life, Black culture, um, from ways that are lesser told, from standpoints that and stories that are lesser seen or understood. Most of what we encounter in a lot of these studies, again, it comes down to either being defeated by white supremacy or some kind of way having overcome it. But when you study things that way, white supremacy, whiteness is still at the center of the study.
Mhm.
You don't ever escape it. And so it's taken me about 20 years. And I think what's unique about my research and people who have come through our Africana studies more exclusively is their ability to escape that sort of box and orientation to understanding Black life.
How do you think that impacts how you put together a classroom and both in terms of syllabus, in terms of structure of teaching? I'm always interested in reflections on how, thinking in a perspective that's not a conventional discipline, a traditional discipline where, it's sort of pre-formatted, sort of what a classroom looks like. If you think a black your comprehensive Black studies background has shaped how you think of yourself as a teacher and practice that.
Um, Certainly, one of the things I always think when I'm mentoring is that, I was them. I was an undergraduate, I was a master's student, I was a PhD student in this seat. And so I'm able to relate to sometimes it's painful to shift some of these fundamental things that you thought define the nature of reality, or to
Mhm,
attempt to think outside of that. There's a pain in that, um, and there's a resistance in there, and there's a need to desire truth. And so I go in knowing that I was you. That's one thing. And in that, I don't baby my students at all. Like, I'm not one of those mama, sister, whatever type of Black studies people. We come in, it's like very in knowing what is possible. I go in very strong. But also because I know I was them and I know what that feels like, I'm able to push in directions based on like the student, where they are. Where did you come from? And when I look into a class, even if it's majority Black, I see diversity. So I'm coming in already a different orientation, a shift. If I have 3 African students, 2 Caribbean students, 7 African American students, 2 Latino students, to me, that's diverse. I'm not looking at diversity as white, Black, Asian. I'm looking at diversity of cultural history and traditions, and like what can be said, what can be pieced together, what's missing. And I very much am heavy handed on them being exposed to a lot of literature. And I think the point of getting a PhD in Africana Studies is knowing which things to select,
mhm,
so people are not reading the same thing over and over by different authors.
mhm,
So I'm also my orientation is not to sort of teach classifications of literature as they've been presented, like, oh, this is all the art stuff, and this is the Pan African stuff, and this is the nationalist stuff. No,
mhm,
I like to organize the syllabus based off huge debates and themes, as opposed to just putting all the classic writers on the text from
mhm,
text together.
mhm,
So I think this gives the students more critical engagement instead of, okay, I have to be able to cite these few names of people in history to sound like a Black studies person.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah, no. Yeah, what is the true difference between the rationale for Pan Africanism in 1900s, and how is that either weaker or stronger in 2000s? And why why would Nigeria, in its contemporary state, want to form their own currency? Why would they need that? And who would be their allies? And then what do my African students have to say about this?
mhm.
So it has to be practical. I don't focus on just historicizing everything because I want it to be alive. That's also unique. Not unique, but my approach.
Well, I'm glad I followed up. Thank you for that. Super interesting, uh, and I like the way you laid out what it means to talk about a debate, right? It's
Yes.
um, well, I have 2 more questions for you. The first one is sort of talking about the past and future of Black studies. What do you think Black studies has historically done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Hmm. I think what Black Studies has done well, we're a little bit over 50 years now. is institutionalization, expansion, and productivity. Black studies is the fastest growing discipline in the world. We never get credited for that. It's much faster and much wider than women's studies and any other studies that has come after Black studies. There was no studies in the academy before Black studies.
Yeah.
The invention of performance studies, cultural studies, women's studies, Latino studies, Chicano studies, all of the studies only exist because Black studies made a way for it to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And said that this is a way that intellectualism and productivity can look. Black studies institutionalization has done well. Now, even though there's always some pushback to should a department be developed or should it be collapsed? Even still, we are, again, the fastest growing and the largest in the 21st century non-traditional discipline in the academy. We have done well with that, generating many conferences, many independent journals, many departments, and many alumni. That is a success. For 50 years, my God. So institutionalization, expansion, and productivity is very high. Now, what's not so well? Some of the major debates have revealed that standardization in Black studies is not done well based off the definition of standardization. So some people think that it is a positive that there are so many different names, nomenclatures for Black studies. Some people see that as a limitation, that you can have Black studies, African American studies, Africana studies, Pan-African studies, African Diaspora studies. So even in nomenclature, there's this huge diversity and compulsory expansion. Global Black studies is a new thing now. So is that a pro or a con? That can be debated. But standardization of curriculum is a limitation, no matter what you name your department. Because why, Dr. Flannery? If every single academic unit across the country, and there are thousands, there's about 2,000 baccalaureate programs. People don't realize there's a lot. And there's, maybe 14, 15 PhD programs, and there's many more master's programs. So if every single unit teaches a different curriculum, then every single Black studies student or even professional comes out not talking about the same thing, not debating the same thing. And so when it comes down to solving problems or or even assessing progress, it can become difficult if we're all doing different projects. Mm-hmm. And we're all using different concepts, and we're all using different theories. So some people see that as a plus, like, oh, people can do whatever they want. I see that as a limitation, that there lacks a standardization. And what does it mean to get a Black Studies degree? What are we expecting you to have known if you get a PhD in Black Studies? Baseline. So these are some things that I think the future of Black Studies, maybe there could be more standardization, especially through organizing bodies like the National Council of Black Studies. I just became the vice president. That's something that I'm going to be invested in.
Thank you for that. I always like, whenever possible, to make intra-podcast references on this question of standardization. From about a year ago, the episode I did with Abdullah Kalima is really fantastic on this. If you know, everybody who knows his work wouldn't be surprised, but it's very deep and very urgent thoughts on exactly this. And so I think it's such a huge issue, and how to get it discussed rigorously, and is there some sort of resolution? I don't know, but I'm glad to hear it on the podcast as a living question. I think it's complicated, but complicated in the best way, and extremely urgent. So thank you for that. And maybe that's your answer to this last question, which is, thinking in a Black Studies context, what's the question you would want us to all be asking, or the issue you would want us to all be thinking about?
Well, I'm not an Afrofuturist in the sort of standard way that's sort of presented, but I want us to truly be invested in working towards things that imagine the world beyond the contemporary moment. Some of Black studies, a large portion of it is sort of stuck in past and present, and it's really a construction of the Black future. And so I think urgent questions have to do with not just what do we don't have right now, but what do we want? And what is the model, the type of research that must be done to execute that. And I don't just mean, again, so that we can have a better job in America or something like this. Or these things are important, better job, better healthcare, but bigger, what is at stake? And what is it that we were born to preserve? What is it that we have inherited, and what should we do with it? I would like us to ask these questions of time, of deep tradition. I'm very much learning a lot more and getting invested in what is meant by rituals and traditions, things, patterns. There are certain things that we do over and over, regardless of the contemporary moment. And why do we do those things? What will we build, in the future? What is it that we can construct? So these are more optimistic. My optimistic vision of the world and what is possible leads me to these questions for Black studies.
I love that. What a fantastic place to wrap up. Thank you so much. And I like that way of thinking about futurism and tradition at the same time.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was nicely put.
Yes.
Yes.
They're not antithetical. They may actually be the same thing.
Yes.
So, yeah, I was really looking forward to this conversation. This has really been fantastic. And this is a great contribution to the series. There's so much stuff in this for people to think about and asking really crucial questions for Black studies scholars and loyalists. And so I appreciate your time so much. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness and insight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And what a wonderful podcast. I'm very grateful to be a part of this.
Oh, thank you. It's great to have you as part of the series. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.